Hi, I'm Ed Bacon, the Rector of All Saints Church, Pasadena. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey of faith, I hope that you'll find something here that speaks to you. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, to be back here at All Saints. I wish that I were talking about a more pleasant topic. However, because I believe the gospel is always good news, even in and especially in difficult and challenging times, there is good news here. And so I'll begin with a verse from John's Gospel. Jesus said, "The time has come for the human one to be glorified." Now, in that verse from John's Gospel, Jesus is actually referring to the cross, which is an appropriate verse for this Lenten season as we journey toward the cross as well. But I believe that that verse also signals an ancient and profound resistance to the violence of male privilege, a resistance that Jesus adopted and which John called the glory of God. And I'll say more about that in a few moments. But I want to first be really clear and explicit right up front that I'm offering these observations as a white gay man. I say this because I am perplexed by the near deafening silence from so many white gay men concerning the twin poisons of sexism and racism in North Atlantic societies today. This is deeply troubling to me, especially since homophobia is but a symptom of a much deeper confluence of male privilege and white supremacy in our history and in our world. If we fail to link male privilege with white supremacy, we do so, I believe, at our grave peril. Since this is Lent, I want to confess my own faults and failures as a white gay man to understand all this and to act on it. I confess this publicly, not for the sake of indulging in the luxury of guilt. We don't have time for that, not this morning, not ever. Guilt is utterly wasted energy. I make this public confession in order to re-energize my own commitment to building a better world and to be held accountable by others in those efforts, especially women and especially people of color. My own commitment involves thinking carefully, both historically and theologically, about the recent flare-up in this war on women. We should note, for example, that the latest fiascos over access to contraception are not just brief regurgitations of a so-called culture war. They are instead instances of a much longer and deeper struggle for control over women's bodies. And therefore, also a struggle for the liberation of all bodies. Women's bodies, men's bodies, children's bodies, the bodies of all other animals, the body of this planet itself, Mother Earth. It is no small leap. Indeed, there is a direct link between the kind of male privilege that lays claim to women's bodies and rapes this planet for resources. I truly believe if we ended the war on women, we would save the planet. Alas, I cannot stand here and declare in good conscience that Christianity has been a consistent, reliable, and articulate force for good in this struggle. It has not. I'm glad to see that I didn't have to make that clear. But I will say that historical Christian traditions, including the Bible, can still be useful tools for both envisioning and enacting a different world, a world where all people and all creatures thrive and flourish just as God has always intended. Furthermore, precisely because religion has been so frequently trotted out to bolster patriarchal domination, I believe we must draw on those very same religious resources in our work for envisioning a different world. If we cede religious texts and practices to those who will do harm with them, we have already lost. To do all this will take a great deal more theological homework and rhetorical strategizing. I throw in rhetorical strategizing because Susan Russell is sitting right here, who is one of the more brilliant people at that effort that I know. I just want to offer briefly this morning one way to do some historical and theological framing for this important work and for the discussion that needs to keep happening here and across this country and indeed throughout the world. So this morning I'll offer, just note 3 historical moments that we dare not forget in this work, and as we reflect on how we got here today. And then I'll return to John's Gospel very briefly and suggest why resistance to patriarchy is a fundamental Christian spiritual practice. So, 3 historical moments that we dare not forget. 1, the link between households and empire. Now, while in some ways this will seem obvious, it's too frequently overlooked. Christianity emerged in the context of Greco-Roman culture and in the crucible of empire. This is important not only for understanding ancient Christianity, but also for analyzing the operations of empire today. Consider, for example, that in ancient Rome, the husband, father, or paterfamilias, was actually not part of the domus, or the household. He was rather in charge of it. And in exactly the same way that the Roman emperor was not actually a citizen of the empire, but instead was the empire's lord. Here we see emerging in ancient Rome what has been the case in Western society ever since. The organization of the household reflects in microcosm the ideologies and structures of the wider society in which that household resides, and vice versa. What emerges from Greco-Roman culture, in other words, is a direct and explicit connection between the ordering of a household and the ordering of the state. I believe all of us need to be very clear about this. The forces of empire will never consider household arrangements to be purely a private matter. The state has always insisted on its right to monitor relational intimacies. More precisely, the right to police women's behavior and exercise control over women's bodies. If this were not the case, we would not be fighting Proposition 8 in courts of law in the state of California today. And indeed, we wouldn't have seen so many religious institutions backing Prop 8 in the first place. That struggle is not about who people love. That struggle is about the role of women, and especially the perceived degradation of male privilege. Sorry, the degradation of white male privilege. And by the way, the next time you use the word domestic to describe your cozy arrangements at home, you might remember that word's Latin roots and look around for an imperial lord lurking behind the furniture somewhere. He's there, trust me. So the second moment that we must not forget, the body of Christ as Christian critique of empire. Now, I'm pleased to report at least this much from ancient history. Early Christianity, by which I mean that which transpired in the first 3 centuries or so, actually provided a subtle and sometimes a direct countercultural critique of the Roman domus as microcosm of the empire and the paterfamilias as the local incarnation of the emperor. Early Christian writers did this by taking seriously the biblical letter to the Ephesians. Quote, "Wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord, and husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." Now, nobody stormed the gates. That text, I know, leaves much to be desired by today's progressive standards, but please note this. Early Christians used that very text to critique the household lordship of the paterfamilias, since there is only one Lord, that is, Jesus Christ. For many of these ancient Christian writers, both husband and wife belonged to the household, because the household was not a microcosm of the empire, but a microcosm of the church as the body of Christ, which is marked by giving oneself for the good of another, both husbands and wives. This had, at least for a short while, a profound impact on improving the lives of at least some Christian women. Of course, he wouldn't have had to have done much to do that, but nonetheless, it was improvement. Third historical moment that we mustn't forget, and this is the collusion of church and state. Because alas, we must not forget that moment in the 4th century when Constantine, the emperor, declared tolerance for Christianity and when Christianity became the official religion of the empire. Note carefully that this embrace of Christianity, for all its unique complexities at that time, actually replicates an old story. Religion is willingly recruited to cooperate with the state to ensure cultural stability and social control. And there is no better way to do that than through the maintenance of male privilege. So there's a key shift that happens in Christian discourse here after that Constantinian moment regarding marriage. No longer do we see Christian theologians routinely critiquing Roman households. To the contrary, we see with remarkable rapidity the church becoming a willing and, dare I say, eager agent of the state regarding household arrangements. And if that doesn't sound familiar to you, I recommend Susan Russell's blog. But a bit more pointedly, a colleague of mine has described well the function of nearly every religious tradition in the ancient Mediterranean world, including Christianity. Those traditions serve to support the dominance of socially superior males by imprinting that dominance with divine blessing. As far as the state is concerned, regardless of what any of us might want to say about it, that religious imprimatur of male dominance is the sole purpose of religion. For indeed, historically and today, imperial rule depends on the exercise of male privilege and all its implications for women, children, slaves, non-human animals, and the planet's many ecosystems. And yes, there are still slaves today. Just Google sex trafficking. Just Google that and be prepared to be appalled by what the economics of male privilege gets away with. Now, if we had more time, you realize I know I'm skimming over lots of stuff here, and I wanted to go back into ancient Greco-Roman culture just as a reminder that what we're experiencing and witnessing today is not new. This is centuries old, this struggle, and we're seeing it in new iterations. But I think we need to do our theological and historical homework around this in order to be as effective as we possibly can in this struggle. So if I had more time, I would trace the legacy of those three historical moments that I just mentioned through the Middle Ages, the Protestant Reformation, the emergence of modern science, and the invention of racialized gender categories. There's a lot to cover here. Let me just give you a sampling, just a couple of highlights from that modern arc. For example, we could note the 18th century discovery of the vagina and the uterus. Yes, 18th century. I'm not making this up. How could I make that up? And that is a great cautionary tale for anyone who wants to look to science as a savior. We should also know... That's the one thing that I wish we had more time to talk about, because it's a great story. We should also note the first appearances of anti-miscegenation statutes, that is, laws forbidding mixed-race marriages, which suddenly necessitated the need to refine what in the world race is. And moreover, those statutes were often applied unevenly depending on the gender of the parties. Could say so much more about that. We must not forget that it was not until 1979 that the last state in this country finally repealed its head and master statutes, which gave husbands ultimate control over all household decisions, and that it wasn't until 1993 that marital rape became a crime in every state in this country. 1993. Prior to which time it was simply the wife's legal obligation to have sex with her husband whenever he demanded it. I also need to mention that the bullying of effeminate gay men and masculine lesbian women and increasingly transgender people has nothing to do with whom these people love. Not a whit. It has everything to do with violating the gendered order of things in which men are dominant and women are submissive. Now notice running through all of these vignettes and moments is a critically important thread, I believe. The tight bond between household arrangements, religious institutions, and the political ideologies of empire. The status of that bond depends in virtually every way on the role of women and who controls women's bodies. Now, a critical piece in this historical fabric that I've been stitching together very briefly this morning is choice. For women, just as for LGBT people and people of color, choice creates a profound sense of gender panic. Free, autonomous people cannot be controlled. And this, of course, is the very basis for a well-functioning democracy. Let me start bringing my remarks here to a close by going back to John's Gospel, because Jesus faced a choice too. He belonged to a rich and vibrant religious tradition that offered a number of options for his life's work and mission. He could have, for example, chosen the path of a Levitical warrior to liberate his people by force from Roman occupation. I say Levitical warrior because the culture of tribal warfare from which that biblical book arose was constructed on an economics of masculinity, in which topping one's enemies with violence if necessary demonstrated covenantal faithfulness to God. But Jesus chose instead to follow the path articulated by the prophet Isaiah. In that book, the Levitical warrior becomes the suffering servant. And rather than topping one's enemies, that servant leads all the nations instead to God's holy mountain, where all those nations learn war no more and beat their swords into plowshares. John described that choice as nothing less than the glory of God. Resisting the violence of male privilege and choosing instead a deep solidarity with all those who are oppressed by such violence is the quintessential revelation of divine splendor. In the light of that glory, recommitting ourselves to ending the war on women is most certainly a good in itself, if only for the sake of women. Full stop. But it means more as well. Recommitting ourselves to the liberation of women's bodies is a recommitment to saving this planet from the ravages of imperial patriarchy. To me, that's a Lenten discipline all of us could quite literally live with, and thereby find ourselves on the road to Easter. Thank you for your kind attention.
So in the remaining time, we have 5 minutes. Raise your hand. Let us get the mics to you, please. There's one up there, Susan, right up there. And we'll take, and I think both of you should be ready to respond. Please go ahead.
A quick statement. We talked about Rush Limbaugh today, and there's a movement afoot to cut off his funding right now that's been enormously successful in only 2 or 3 days. 6 of his major sponsors have now dropped him. And we need to keep the pressure on to get him off the air. So everybody, figure out who the sponsors are. It's very easy on the internet. And express your extreme displeasure for those sponsors. And get this guy off the air.
Hi, this is to Jay. I was listening to your presentation, which is brilliant, by the way. And it sort of struck me that although you sort of geared it towards the Western culture is being demonized around the world, particularly in Islamic countries and also in Africa, which is also tied to the gay issue. Could you speak to that a little bit?
How much time do we have? Very briefly, that's a great question. I'll return. One way to respond to this is I heard Frank Griswold, the former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, speak briefly to this when he said that during his years as presiding bishop, when he would visit with his colleagues in African provinces in the Anglican Church, one of the things that he learned that was very important to him is that the issue of gay and lesbian relationships and so forth, it really doesn't have much to do with biblical exegesis. It doesn't have to do with loving relationships, monogamy, all these things and so forth. It really had to do with their perception that we were asking them to change their gendered understanding of how the world works. It's about gender. And it's about the gendering of relationships. So even the idea of peer marriage that we have between a man and a woman, well, at least ideally speaking, in this country is also problematic. And so a relationship is by definition of unequal power. And referring to sexual relationships in the ancient Mediterranean world, a biblical scholar put it this way: sex in the ancient Mediterranean was basically eroticized inequality. So the idea that's just one tiny slice of that pie, and I think it's a really important conversation to have about cultural imperialism and how that gets used on both sides of this divide. It's a huge question. I thank you for asking.
Last question.
Hi, thank you both so much. I really appreciate you being here today. I just wanted to make a comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I'm what's called a perinatal psychiatrist, which means that I manage major mental illness in women who are pregnant and postpartum through counseling, therapy, and when necessary, medications. And I have a clinic at USC, and I came across a statistic in my own clinic through data I've collected that 70 to 80% of the women I see have a history of sexual abuse. I have women in my clinic who are pregnant because they were literally raped by their fathers. Okay, this is here in East LA, 10 miles, 8 miles from here right now. And when I hear about the war on contraception, it goes so far beyond women's bodies to their minds and their brains. Because what they're told when they do come to me and they need help is that not only are you sacrificing your body, often for a pregnancy that is not something you chose because you didn't have access to health care, but you also have to deny yourself mental health care because it might be bad for the baby. When in reality, the mental health aspect of this wreaks havoc on women, and the depression and the psychosis and the substance abuse and the homelessness and everything that goes along with it. So I just wanted to raise that point to this group in general and also to you guys, because when the Planned Parenthood and the work that's done, I don't know if there's a mental health component there that's in any kind of systemized way. I certainly hope so. I assume there's at least counseling. But it's an absolutely vital issue that is still so far off people's radar screens, it just is infuriating, as you can tell. So anyway, I just wanted to raise that point.
Thank you so much for that, because that holistic approach, I think, is really important and was lacking from my comments. And so I appreciate that important reminder. And a colleague of mine recently reminded me of a really succinct way of thinking about what we mean when we're talking about patriarchy, which is a categorized ranking, right? Men, and especially white men, are at the top, and everything has to be categorized below them in terms of gender, sexualities, race and ethnicities, cultures, and so forth. But it's a hierarchy. Patriarchy is about a hierarchy with white, straight men at the top. And that means that all those services that you were just describing, mental health services, physical services, counseling, all of that, is considered less than when it's about people who are lower on the rank. It's that simple and that disturbing.
Thanks, Jay and Juliana. Oh, that was wonderful. That was all right.